we have to dare different in order to get ourselves there. And I realize that there's a lot of fear in that, right? Because we really have to let go of a lot of things. And that's been the huge part of the journey for me, is like, as I started, it's like, it was all about me. It's so not about me, I recently tweeted out something like, I was the host, right? Like, these kids are the guests in my house. This is about me. I no longer believe that. I am the guest in the house of their learning, and I am there to support that. And that has completely changed my whole frame of mind for how for what my role is in the classroom with my kids. So yeah.
Hoy es el día que extraño es cuando te encuentro por segunda vez y no me conformo con mirar tu piel. Mañana te invito a un doble.
Welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. Today's show is about the process, about the long view, about being happy with incremental progress, about seeing improvement as something we constantly strive for, and about reflecting as professionals. See, I posit that our instant gratification, rapid delivery world impacts the way we see our work. I'm a teacher, so here I'm talking about the education profession, but I'd be willing to bet this applies elsewhere. We begin as newbie teachers, mostly terrified for that first year, swimming in the deep water right from the jump. We learn from experience, we learn from mentors, we add to our toolkit. We reflect on that first year, and we come back determined to make year 2 even better. But I think that the internet, on-demand professional development, and blogs, and especially social media, create an illusion that teachers should get better, be amazing now. I think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, that the prevalence of seasoned teachers online and their amazing resources and strategies and pointers, well, it all accelerates our expectations. And that's to say nothing of the education charlatans out there, the people who taught for 1 year and then became consultants, selling us the products and platforms supposedly designed to make our classrooms incredible right now. Yeah, all of this impacts the way we see ourselves as professionals. Well, my guest today has some wise words about trusting the process and reflecting along the way.
Yeah, I'm Monte, Syrie. I'm up here in Washington State. I teach high school ELA. This will be my 27th year in public education. I taught for 7 years at the middle school level to begin my career, and then for the last 19, I've been at the high school, and it's been quite a journey.
I reached out to Monte because I've long admired his online presence, tweets about patience and the elbow grease required to become a better teacher. On top of that, he's the author of Project 180, an online diary of sorts, in which Monte works through the agony, ecstasy, and everything in between in his long career as a professional. Be sure to check out the show notes for a link to the project and his forthcoming book. Well, thanks so much for joining me. I find that in reading your work and following you on Twitter, there's so much reflection in what you do. And we live in such an instant gratification age. And I feel like that even seeps into our professional lives. We expect to be good right away at things. Right? New teachers find things online and hear from people on social media, and they just want to be that great teacher right away. And your work suggests that it's a process. Teaching is a process. Teaching is a journey. I wonder if you could take us back to you as a young teacher, Monte as a young teacher. What were you like as a young teacher? How did you see education when you first were starting out your career?
Wow, isn't that a question? So, Dan, as I think back to my first year teaching, I think what really stands out immediately is that it was a fast, big game to begin, and you just remarked about I think we want to be good right away. And I had a successful student teaching experience. I was successful in college, yada, yada, yada. But as we know, there's very little that actually prepares us for what that experience is truly going to be like. And as I think back to my earlier years, and that desire to be good, if you will, and maybe it's not even the desire to be good; it's the fear of not being good. That seems to be the early journey that so many of us are on, and I think that journey unfortunately continues for too many teachers long into their careers. We don't want to be the fraud, right? And I think that leads to some really unhealthy things, imposter syndrome. The list goes on. But as I think back to those early years, I think for me, that desire to not be bad, or that worry of not being good, led me to make it all about me. And so everything became about me. And I'm not suggesting now that we're not important. I just think we're less important in terms of what the experience will and should be in the classroom. And so with that, when things didn't go my way, and because I thought it was about me, I found myself running a compliance-based classroom. And I think that's what so many of us do, is that we put the focus on ourselves. And when things don't go well, it can't be about us. It's got to be about the kids. It's got to be about this, that, or the other thing. And so because we don't have the tools to necessarily, and I think reflection is a huge part of that process, the tools to really see ourselves in our work and to try to figure out, that this is a process, that it is a journey. We're just worried about that product at the end. And unfortunately, oftentimes that becomes grades, but we'll get into that maybe a little later on. And so for me, I think as my early career began and continued, it became about running a compliance-based classroom. Fortunately in year two, I did make an important discovery, in terms of relationships and the role that those play in constructing a meaningful experience for kids. But it wasn't enough. We talk a big game about relationships all the time and the power that they have in the classroom, and they absolutely do. But I think that there's more to it than that. And I think what I found for too many years going forward from there, Dan, was I did have the ability to form and sustain great relationships with kids, but I still had to play the compliance game. I had to comply. So, by proxy, my kids had to comply, right? Like, I was so worried about what my grades were reflecting. I was worried about what the teacher in the next room over was doing. I was worried about the district initiatives and all these things going on. And so I was never able to get to create that connection that I think I have now in those early years in my career. And it caused me a lot of consternation, I think, and it's like, I knew that things weren't as good as they could be. Right. And so I just kind of settled for what was, and I found myself stuck in the status quo, even though I hated teaching, in that space, because I realized that it wasn't providing the authentic learning experiences for my kids that I believed I could, but I didn't know how to get beyond that. And so after years of wondering and worrying about it, finally in year 20, I kind of took a bold leap, and this is where Project 180 came into being. I had gotten tired of playing the grading game, if you will, because I felt like grades were getting in the way of what really mattered, and that was learning. And so grading was always something that was a problem. I hated report card time. I hated having to play the judge at the end. I felt like I was, pardon my language here, I felt like I was full of shit half the time because, it's just like, here I am supporting kids along the way. It's like, oh, by the way, I've got to stamp this grade on here. And the kids are like, what? There was not always that obvious connection for them. And so finally in year 20, I said, you know what? I think the only way that I'm going to get beyond this is I'm going to take grades off the table. And in year 20, the year that Project 180 began, I gave all my kids an A for the entire year. And you know, that's a long story. And so, but what was so important about taking that first big, bold step, if you will, Dan, was that it put me in a place where I felt like I could truly have an impact on the learning experiences that were going on in my classroom, because it was just me, the teacher, my kids, and 180 days of working together to grow and learn forward. And I really had to dig in with the, like, okay, compliance gone, right? Because that grades are so power based, right? Like we rely on them for so many things, from behavior to academics. Those things were gone. So now I had to learn how to use my influence. And I have found that in kids' commitment. So that in a nutshell is kind of the journey that where I began to where I am right now.
And I imagine a lot of teachers listening would be nodding along, hearing echoes of their own journey, that it took you to get to year 20 to, as you say, take that bold step. And when we're younger, imposter syndrome is really common. And I think you brought up an interesting point, the contrast, the clash between relationships, authenticity in our assessment in our classroom, and compliance. Do you feel like throughout your career you have been explicitly or just implicitly told by the district, by higher ups, that compliance is, even if they don't use that word, that compliance is actually what you should be doing because that's what you need to do to get the results?
Yes. And I think it's probably been more implicit than explicit, and I think that unfortunately, we kind of perpetuate that narrative too amongst each other. I don't even think it's necessarily always top down. I just think it's pervasive throughout, because that's how the experience was for us. That's how we think. Because like oftentimes, like the first response when I told teachers that I was going to just give my kids grades, or excuse me, A's for the entire year, the first response was that they're not going to do anything, right? Like you're not going to have that thing to hold over them to get and that was a real wonder and worry for me, because for 20 years that's how I had conducted business. And so I think from top to bottom, from side to side, all the way throughout, we perpetuate this idea that the only way that we can conduct business with our kids is through a compliance-based model. And even in those moments where we're like, dude, there is better out there. We don't know how to take the steps, and I think, Dan, it has to be sometimes a brave, bold step. I think we have to dare different in order to get ourselves there. And I realize that there's a lot of fear in that, right? Because we really have to let go of a lot of things. And that's been the huge part of the journey for me, is like, as I started, it's like, it was all about me. It's so not about me. I recently tweeted out something like, I was the host, right? Like, these kids are the guests in my house. This is about me. I no longer believe that. I am the guest in the house of their learning, and I am there to support that. And that has completely changed my whole frame of mind for how for what my role is in the classroom with my kids. So yes, I think that the compliance-based approach, historically, contemporarily, is still very pervasive throughout the system.
A conversation I find myself having a lot with teachers is about the overemphasis we have on content. You talk about letting things go and making it about us. And so often it's about making about our content and feeling like, well, if I don't get through this stuff, if I don't cover this stuff. And I appreciate you talking about grading that way, that it's not, we're talking about ungrading, as it's called by a lot of people, not just I took grades away. It's a whole process of rethinking assessment. I want to read something that you wrote recently. You tweeted, I was a teacher for many years before discovering I really wasn't teaching. I was talking, assigning, grading, and I thought I was teaching. Truly, I wasn't. I didn't start teaching until I learned to respond to each kid's learning. That is when I became a teacher.
Yeah, and for me, that is really the gist of the whole journey, for me, Dan. And in those first 20 years, heck, to be honest, even longer than that, maybe, I did feel like, when I was assigning and talking and doing those things, I was teaching. But now I don't feel like if I'm not giving kids feedback and supporting kids, I don't begin until they need me, and they need to do first, and then I need to meet them where they are in their learning, and that is when I become a teacher. I tell my kids their work breathes existence into my role. And when I am responding to each kid, not all kids, and I think that there's a major distinction there between the ideas of all and each. That is when I feel like I have truly become a teacher. And my gosh, that was not who I was for too many years in the classroom. But what's concerning about it is that I was sure I was right in terms of, like, I gave the instructions, I gave the task, I provided the grades, I have done my job. Too infrequently in there was actually giving the support for kids to learn forward. And so I don't think that I was teaching. I was assigning, I was talking, and I was grading, but I wasn't teaching.
Let's talk about that word support, because I think that, to me, that's the key word in what you just said. What does that mean to you, that support that extends beyond, as you say, just the simple assigning and grading? What does support look like in your classroom?
Well, I don't know how to support kids until I know where they are. And I think even beyond the where is the who they are. And that's where I think relationships really go to the next level, is when we're using that as an opportunity to know our kids, beyond just, our transactional interactions with them, that we're making consistent connections with them. And so by support, is where I meet them, and by meeting them, by meeting their person, as well as their I don't know, for their student self, right? Like, and so for me, support is giving each kid what he, she, or they need in that moment, and moving forward, and not worrying about, like, well, you didn't give this to this kid, or you didn't give this to that kid, or you didn't do this for all kids. I am meeting each kid where he or she or they are, and that is all that I can do. And if they can't move forward or grow from that meeting, then I don't believe I have supported them. The other thing that I think about when I think about support is there is a marriage there, right? Like, I can't expect more than I can support. I would rather have a classroom of high support than high expectations. We oftentimes throw out this idea, well, I have high expectations. If you don't have the high support to match that, you're a fraud. And I'm sorry to say that. I mean, that's maybe a little unfair, but have those high expectations, but by damn, you better have the support to help the kids meet those high expectations then, or you're living a little bit of a lie, I think.
Because those high expectations might be just more a reflection of you, making it about you, and not the students. Yeah, for sure. Can you give an example of maybe a way that your practice has shifted, a specific example, something you used to do, and basically kind of here's what Sai used to do, and here's what he does now in this new mindset?
Yeah, when I think I'll take writing as an example, right? Because that's where a lot of my work is focused with kiddos. And I think about, like, things like rubrics, right? And I think about my use of rubrics, and how initially I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I've been waiting for my entire career, right? Because, like, when I started in '96, people were not talking a whole lot about rubrics, right? And then they kind of came along, with the 6 traits and other things. And most of us who teach ELA have gone through this, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is what I needed. And all that it really ended up being, though I didn't know this for too many years, Dan, was that it just gave me a way to justify my grading. It didn't give me a way to support learning. And so, and for years I was and I knew that for a long time, but I was afraid because I didn't want to be the one to poo-poo rubrics, right? Because everybody, I mean, they're the Rosetta Stone of learning, right? Like all you have to do is look at the 4 levels and or whatever the levels are. And again, more often than not, it really wasn't supporting my young writers. And so now what I do is I just keep it simple. There's success criteria. This is what I need the kids to be able to do, to show me. And I'm very, very simple and explicit about, this is what I need you to do, kiddo. In order for you to produce something, so now that I can join you in the feedback response cycle. So now instead of getting done to get to the grading, it's like, let's get going so we can get to the feedback response cycle, because again, that is where the support comes. That is where I'm responding. That is where I feel like I'm teaching. And it's no longer about a grade. I don't attach grades to it at all. It's just simply, this is where you are. This is what I need you to do differently. And this is the support that I'm going to give you to be able to move forward. I just use 3 numbers in my grade book. 1 is done, right? So if Dan is my student, Dan has met the success criteria, 1 is done. And my kids know that. So really, it's just communication. And that's all the grade should be anyway, is just communication, I believe. A 0.7, a 0.7, my mom's trying to call me. Dang it. Sorry. A 0.7 is they're still learning on the table. My kids know that there is feedback that is waiting for them, and an opportunity for them to respond and for us to continue the response feedback cycle. And then just simply a 0, though I'm going to change that up this year. I don't use zeros in the traditional sense, but a 0 is just communicating like, kiddo, get this to me as soon as you can. It's missing, right? And so I think the contrast there from previous Monte to present Monte is get it done to get it graded. Let's get going so we can get to learning, and I can join you in your learning. The other thing that I do with that, Dan, because some are like, okay, well, if we're giving this learn forward feedback, I can't do all of that all at once. If I have a 500-word essay, there are going to be so many things to address, and I think teachers feel like we have to do everything at once. I do no more than 3 things, right? Like, what are the 3 things that I see right now, or even the one thing? Maybe it's just one major thing. It's like, this is where I'm joining. This is where you are in your learning, kiddo. This is where I'm going to meet you, and this is how we are going to move forward. So let's say that Dan, it's going to take me all year just to get through this essay with him, right? Because we have those kids who need that level of support. I use what I call a factor of 5. I tell my kiddos, like, we're going to move this out through 5 levels of engagements for the feedback response process, right? And that doesn't mean that we will have addressed every single thing in the essay that needs to be addressed, but by gosh, we will grow. You will learn forward. And I believe that. I mean, there's no way they can't. When we're in this feedback response process, I'm giving kids feedback. I'm giving them support and opportunity and direction to move it forward. And by the time we're done with those 5, I will move it in the grade book to a 1, even if it's not fully addressed, even if we haven't created the Grecian urn, as Kelly Gallagher would say, right? It doesn't matter. We're just moving forward as writers. And so that is the biggest thing. I'm just eager to join kids in their learning and not worried about, grading, labeling, sorting, ranking them.
An emphasis on growth versus grades.
Yes.
Yeah. Feedback's so important. And that less is more mentality you're talking about is really key. Sometimes I think we feel like with feedback, we need to tell them all of the things they need to work on. And it's too much. You strip it down. And like you said, what really matters in this moment.
Yes.
Over at let'schangeeducation.com, you are writing for something you call Project 180. And you write that the mission is to change education by challenging the status quo and discovering new paths to learning. I think we've talked quite a bit already about the status quo, but is there anything else you'd add to what you define as education's status quo?
Yeah, I think in a word, Dan, comfort, right? Um, and I've often said that we embrace the status quo not for its wisdom, but its comfort, right? Um, and I think a lot of us become kind of like resentful role players in the status quo because we know that there's better. We know that we haven't arrived. We know that this isn't necessarily good, but we do it anyway because it's comfortable. And I think it's hard for us to get uncomfortable. And to be fair, a teacher's, an educator's existence is a hurried, harried existence, right? Like it is full tilt boogie, as we all know. And so it's hard to think about like, I am just making it through my day. How am I going to, upend education and fight the status quo when I can barely, make it through my day? And so I think because it's comfortable, I think we become complacent, and it becomes the default setting for so many because it's comfortable. And Project 180 became about let's get uncomfortable. And it's been huge for me because I seek to make myself uncomfortable.
So let's talk about Project 180.
Okay.
How does it work? How do you see it benefiting you as a practitioner? How do you see it benefiting you as a person, benefiting your students? How does Project 180 roll out for you?
Well, geez, well, I wrote a book about it, right? I mean, so yeah, I mean, there's no short answer to that, but I think I can kind of capture the gist of it here, Dan. And so earlier we talked about this false idea and hope of being the good teacher, right? And I think that leads many of us down a path where we get frustrated, we get complacent, we wonder and worry that maybe we're not up to par with our colleagues, yada yada yada. And for me, and I've tweeted this out and I've talked about this a lot. It's like I gave up on being a good teacher. I gave up on being a great teacher, and I have embraced. I'm not going to say settled. I have embraced the idea of just being a better teacher, of being better than I was. And we know how it works, right? Sometimes I just need to be better than I was a minute ago in the classroom, right? I mean, I think about the course of my day where, I rolled this out first period, effed it up, and by the time I figured it out sixth period, I'm going back to my class the next day and apologizing and saying, hey, I'd like to retry this, right? Like, this is how I wish I had done this. And so for me, I kind of latched on to that idea that it's just like, it is just simply a journey, right? And I know that sounds cliche, and that's what Project 180 about it's the ever journey. It is the teacher's journey. It's just about trying to be reflective about our present practice with the earnest efforts to just want to make it better, not worrying about being good, not worried about being great, and my mantra, kind of by accident, during the whole process became do, reflect, do better. That's how I live my life. That's how I conduct myself in the classroom. That is what I encourage my kids to do in their own learning, is just to simply reset every single day with me. Let's examine what we've done and let's just try to make it better. And so I talked earlier about comfort. The whole idea behind 180, at least part of the name, is I learned early on that if I could flip myself upside down, that was uncomfortable for me. Well, no one likes to be uncomfortable for too long, so I have to find the answers. And that's where the reflection comes into play, so I can spin myself another 180 degrees, to put my feet back on the ground, only to ask myself another question, to turn myself upside down again. And so I really think better begins with a question. And it's a reasoned reflection about exploring and examining our current practices to make sure that we never find ourselves in that place of comfort again. I worry a lot, Dan, that people see, all my stuff out there on Twitter, that I've written this book, that, somehow Monte Syrie has come up with the answers to education. That is not the case, right? What I have come up with is, I believe, an opportunity for us to think about our work in terms of simply continuing the journey, making ourselves uncomfortable with the whole intent of finding the betters that are out there. We just keep chasing better. The cycle never stops. I'm never at rest.
And the mantra, do reflect, do better. How do your students respond to that?
I think that they find freedom in that. But let's be honest, by the time they get to me in 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, right, they're pretty fixed in their mindsets already, and they're not accustomed to saying, hey, let's approach this a little differently. Let's not worry about the grade at the end. Let's worry about the learning during the process here. And the worst, I tell my kids, like, the worst that's going to happen is better, right? The worst that can ever happen in my class is better. So when we are engaged in that feedback response process, initially the kids are like, oh my gosh, I did bad. It's like, because they see any kind of feedback is criticism, right? Like, and they see things in terms of good and bad. And I work an entire year to get them to frame things in the idea of better, not in good or bad. The worst that can ever happen, kiddo, with this assessment, my kids don't have test anxiety. One, I don't give tests. Two, when I give assessments, they know that the sole purpose is for me to meet them in their learning so we can make it better. And so I think my kids find it liberating. And I think they find themselves wondering, why hasn't it been like this all along?
Wow. Yeah, mindsets are so important in everything that we do, but in the classroom especially. And it, at times it feels like we want to keep the status quo, and so we try to layer things like growth mindset on top of it to give the illusion that we are somehow moving. That we're student centered. You talked about your students kind of having fixed mindsets. I want to dig into this a little bit more. What kind of mindsets do you see them coming to you with? And then throughout the course of the year, how do you see that shift?
Yeah. So I think, in terms of particularly our content area, ELA, kids come to me with a fixed mindset. Either they're a good or a bad reader, right? Or they're a good or a bad writer, or I'm a C student, I'm an A student, and so those are the fixed mindsets that I find them coming to me with. And I also find them having fixed mindsets in terms of like the work that we do, that the purpose is just to complete a transaction with me for a grade. And they have been conditioned, and I don't fault the kids for it. They have been conditioned to play those roles, that they just do the work. And so when they do that, it's just about getting it done to get a grade. Well, in my class, that's just not how it plays out anymore. And so I think that fixed mindset is a real challenge for a lot of them. Thinking back to the year of the A, right? Like the kids are like, you're saying no matter what, you like, even if I don't do any of the work, I get an A for the year. And I'm like, I have to do that because I've gifted you, if you will, the A for the year. Now it's about learning. You can sit here and for 180 days and do nothing. It's entirely up to you. But I think that there's an important opportunity here where we can work together. And so it's not quite as extreme as that anymore because I don't just gift the A. But it really is about, like, there's more to the work than just completing a transaction to put points in the grade book. The point is for us to have an opportunity to grow forward.
What advice would you give a teacher listening now that really feels the philosophy of what you're doing, but really doesn't know where to start? What's the bold step? How does one sort of step away from that compliance model and get into that more student-centered model?
Okay. I'm going to be honest and say not without some fear, right? And so I think that when I ask people or encourage people to brave their betters and to dare their difference, that there is going to be a little bit of fear involved. All right. And so I'm not going to try to polish it and say that that's not going to happen. So one, expect there to be some fear, expect to be uncomfortable. Two, Be armed with your why, right? You know, I think back to my bold step. It's like, why do you want to give kids an A for the entire year? You know, and it disarms people when you have your why in mind and you are ready to present it. I think for me, there were a lot of whys, but my most important why was I wanted to grow. I wanted to grow. I needed to grow as a teacher. I knew that I had been living a lie for too long and I needed to grow. And in order to do that, I had to take a big, bold step away from the status quo. Yes, it's going to make things messy this year. Yes, it's going to make things a little difficult. Yes, I'm going to have to, and I don't even say have to. Yes, I'm going to get to explain my reasoning and my rationale for doing that. And so don't act on a whim, act on a strong why. It was not a moment of whim for me to give kids an A for the entire year. Yes, I made it novel. I hand fashioned wooden A's for them, handed to them as they walked through the door, but it wasn't a damn whim. I had a strong why, and I needed to grow as a teacher. And I knew that in order for me to do that, I had to get grades off the table and to put the focus on learning. And when you think about a supervisor or a department member or a colleague who wants to engage you in this conversation for this crazy different that you want to do, but your soul, your spirit is telling you have to do this, know your why. And if you know your why, the what's in the hows will all fall into place. I believe that. But they won't fall into place permanently. They'll continue to fall into place as you spin through the 180 cycle and you are consistently reflecting on and trying to make better what you're doing. I make my colleagues dizzy, right? Because I am never sitting in place. It's like, okay, what are we doing differently this year? It's become just a part of our journey. They're excited, like, okay, how are we going to spin things this year? So I think, Dan, long story short, know your why.
And your why comes through really clearly on Project 180 on the posts. You have some really interesting tools and examples of your work in the classroom, but it's all surrounded by a lot of deep reflection and the why you're doing it, and just the fact that you are able to explain why you're doing it, as you say, that gives you that. Not only that purpose, but also that ability to communicate it in a way that disarms people. Yeah. And the project's now a book, Better, a teacher's journey. How did that come together, and what was that process like?
Okay, wow. I never intended it to be a book, right? And so Project 180 really started with a commitment to sharing my journey through a daily blog, and that's where Let's Change Education came into play. And I did not anticipate that I would do it for 5 straight years. But by the time that was done and roughly, 1,100 posts later, I decided I was going to turn it into a book. And I had begun the process. I was going to self-publish. And then by matter of fortune, Codebreaker contacted me. Brian Aspinall from Codebreaker contacted me and said, "Hey, Monte, I'd love to help you turn Project 180 into a book." And the ball just kind of rolled from there. And so what it's really about is going back through my 5-year journey, and finding, in keeping with the whole idea of the journey and the adventure, going back and finding those waypoints, right? Like those places that are worth, like, GPS, you put a waypoint in there. Those are those places that are worth going back and revisiting. And so I have handpicked 90 different posts from the 5 years and the summers in between. And that's what we made into a book. It wasn't supposed to be 2 books. It's going to be 2 books because the first book, which covers the first 3 years and the 2 summers in between, just got to be way too big. And so we decided to turn it into 2 books. And so book 1 will cover years 1 through 3. Book 2 will cover years 4, 5, and beyond. And so, Dan, as I've said earlier in the podcast, it is not a book of answers. It is a book of betters. and my betters, right? That doesn't mean it's better than your better. It's just like these are the things that I have learned and I find worth sharing along my way.
When you went back through and you were curating the posts for the book, were there any in particular that jumped out at you like, oh my gosh, I'd forgotten about this one. This one's got to go in the book. Maybe something early from the journey.
Yeah, too many times to be honest. So much so that it was really hard to pare 900 posts down to 90. One that really stands out, and I think one that's just kind of become emblematic, if you will, of my transformation. It's a post called "A Different Sort," and it's where I sat down with one of my kiddos with dyslexia, and at the end of it, I was like, F it, right? It's because here's the deal. I sat down with her and basically did her assessment with her, right? Like we sat down, but that's what I discovered my kiddo needed in that moment, And again, there were still the little voice on my shoulder saying, you can't do this. It's not fair to the other kids. It's going to sully the grade and everything else. And I was like, F it. I don't care anymore. This is my room and I am going to support kids as I see fit, and I don't think anyone, because we worry about like someone's going to come in and observe and see what we're doing. It's like, that doesn't happen as much as we worry about, right? Like, that's that fear. And it's like, even if they did, great. Let's have this conversation about why I'm sitting down with this kid right now. It's because it's what she needs. And that's where I talked about, like, this is what I'm giving to each, not what I'm trying to give to all, because I think inadvertently that neglects too many of the kids when we just have that all focus. And so there's one post that really stood out. I think what was really interesting for me is to see the different themes throughout the years, and not even like I didn't anticipate that this was going to be the theme, for this particular year. But as I went back and examined the post, it's like, oh, there's kind of a theme emerging here. And year one was the year of the A, and so I went through that. Year two is the year of the R. I discovered how many different R's. I mean, we know the 3 R's in education, right? And then the fourth one, which has fortunately become relationships. I discovered like 20 more R's that I hadn't really even considered. And then year three is a really important year for me. And the title of that one is Helping Humans. It was a huge transformational year for me. And that one, A Different Sort, comes from year three, where I finally said, you know what? There are humans in the room. I am here to help those humans. That is all that matters. Despite all this other administrivia and other things that are threatening from the outside, here I am in this moment with my kids. And so there were so many of those posts that gave me goosebumps to go back and read again. And then I'm excited to share those with the folks. And again, I think it's the ever journey, Dan. I think people are going to be nodding all the way throughout the book. It's not just my journey. Matter of fact, I don't even want you thinking about my journey when you read the book. I want you thinking about your journey. My hope is that it's not instructive, but ignitive, that it's igniting your own passion and desire and dreams to dare your difference and to brave your betters.
Well, I will definitely be linking all of this in the show notes. Monte, you're found at letschangeeducation.com, Project 180. The book is Better, A Teacher's Journey, Project 180, Book 1. I want to thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciated this conversation, your passion, and all your reflection. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate it.
A huge thanks to Monte for joining me on the show and sharing his perspective, sharing his long view perspective. And I really encourage you to check out Project 180 and the book, sort of the greatest hits of Project 180, to see a teacher really describing the process, the growth, the ups and downs. And it's just a great perspective to have, especially for young teachers. I think any teacher, but especially young teachers, who I think we get captivated by the now. We get captivated by social media. I find myself doing this too. You see these amazing teachers providing these strategies and resources, and there's educational organizations providing resources and strategies and platforms, and the pressure to be amazing now feels really real. And Monte's a good reminder that teaching is a journey. Always has been, and even in the internet world, it still is. Thanks for checking out What's the Big Idea. As always, comments, questions, anything on Twitter and Instagram at BigIdeaEd. I hope your school year is off to a great start. Stay safe. Be well, everyone. See you next time.